In this video, we're going to talk about wireframing your designs, and wireframing is where the rubber really meets the road. So by the time you've gotten to wireframing, as we've talked about in the early stages of prototyping, you've come up with your point of view. You've got some storyboards that show how you get from a particular setting or task to satisfaction. And you've probably built some paper prototypes or other rapid, low-fidelity creations that help you think about what your design should achieve. So as you go through, before you get to code here or a final version, in between, we've got a couple of things, and that's what this sequence of videos is going to talk about. Right here, we've got our wireframes. So what a wireframe does is it takes the point of view that you've got, it makes sure that you can complete the scenarios that you've laid out in your storyboards, and it starts to instantiate the rough ideas from your paper prototype into a really concrete user interface design. Here's an example of that. This is from a student in my class who did a wonderful job of creating a wireframe of a course homepage. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out about this design. The first is that everything that is on this screen is the set of stuff that will be in your ultimate user interface design, whether it's a web page or an app or anything else. Also, what you see is that the relative sizes and locations, all of that stuff is spec'd out here. There are some things that we haven't shown yet in this wireframe. The first of those is we aren't yet at the stage of fonts. We're not yet at the stage of colors. And in fact, some of the content here is going to be Greeked out or shown as lines. You can do these wireframes hand-drawn like Andy did here. You can also do wireframes. I like Keynote or PowerPoint or Google Slides, or any of the rough visual layout apps are great for wireframing. The reason I picked Andy's prototype, which is paper, is that I wanted to remind you that we're really not making the final version yet. And so in addition, obviously the fonts and the colors, they're going to come a little later. One advantage of staying in paper, if you can, is that it helps convey to your design team where you're at. That as you share something that looks more and more polished, even if you know that it's an early design, people will start to critique it as that. So the moment that you put in fonts and colors, people are going to start to talk about, should it be red or should it be blue? And not, are we thinking about, does it accomplish the task? One thing that I've seen often is that a team that follows a good early stage prototyping process will keep the tasks in mind throughout. And one thing that those can somehow get lost right around here in the process, that as you start to get ready to code, you can be like, oh, okay, well, how are we going to implement this? And it's easy to forget about all of those users. So if you've been using personas or you've got tasks written down, keep those posted all around your design area. Keep those tasks in mind as you create your wireframe. Because what you want to think about in a wireframe is, how does your layout achieve your task? This is not okay, there's got to be 3 buttons because things have 3 buttons. You want to think about really what's the task here. Now, the way that I recommend laying out a wireframe is think about the information that the user will need and start to set up a grid system for how that'll be displayed. So what you're going to have in your wireframe, like Andy had on hers, is you're going to have a clear and consistent grid from top to bottom. For example, in a lot of web pages on a desktop, and we'll talk more about responsive design in the next video, you might have 3 columns where you might have some primary navigation across the top, some secondary navigation across the side here, some additional information on the right side, and then your main content in here. So this is one common template for a web page. When people start to lay things out in code, they often forget to pay attention to these grid lines. There are reasons occasionally to break a grid. You're going to make like a funky page where everything's kind of bouncing all over the place because it's like an edgy nightclub or something like that. That's one thing. But in general, unless you have a really good reason, don't let one thing wander off over here and another thing wander off over there. Everything should get a grid. Often when you're laying out, and this is another reason that it's nice to work on paper, is that if you happen to have a big screen, it can be easy to make stuff that will require a big screen. But most people will be seeing this from a laptop or a tablet or something that's smaller. Make sure that all of the text on your page is large enough and of sufficient contrast to be legible. And think about the aspect ratio for the particular content that you have. When you create your grid, make sure to think about what other languages things will likely end up in. We're not going to have time to dive deep into internationalization here, but a good rule of thumb that I learned in typography classes as a student was that if German is one of your languages, make sure to test everything in German first, because it tends to be longer than other Western languages. And so there's this wonderful recent tweet when Twitter changed what they called their like button. And without checking it in German, it of course way overflowed the space that was allotted to it. There's probably a German word that's something like Schadenfreude for when your graphic designer doesn't think to have their grid system accommodate your language. Now, the thing that a wireframe is really great for is think about how you're going to use the vertical space, so that if you've got a big title here and some article content here, a wireframe is a nice time to think about how you're going to leave a nice gap and give some good white space here before the next thing. When the content is related, the content should be close together. When the content is not related, the content should be further apart. If you're going to include any kind of data graphic on your page, for example, if you're going to have some bars that show progress or a pie chart that shows fractions, think about how it accomplishes the user's task. Think about how it fits into the page here, and make sure to leave enough space for it. One good rule of thumb when laying text out is that for the most part, if you have multi-line text, it should generally be, for Western languages, left aligned. That if you have many lines of text and things are centered, it's actually difficult for the eye to follow where to go from line to line. Whereas if things are left aligned, even when they vary, this grid edge gives your eye a nice anchor to know where to read from. Obviously, this will be flipped for languages that go the other direction. One trick that you can do is if you're going to have tabular data, like forms, for example, you can right align the left column and then left align the right column. So if you're going to have, name, address, phone number, email, other form data, this works really well. This can also work well if you were to do print layout where you're laying out a book. You can right align the page numbers. So page 7 is this, page 163 is this.